Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. I'm joined now by journalist and papal biographer Austen Ivereigh, who's recently back from Frascati in Italy, where he was part of a group of many clergy and lay people who were trying to synthesise people's voices from all over the world as part of the Synod on Synodality. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that experience. Austen, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Wendy.
Well, I think a good place to start is just explaining what is the Synod on Synodality.
Sure. The Synod on Synodality, as it's become known, began in October 2021. It's a 3-year process. It's going to conclude in October 2024 with a big meeting of bishops in Rome. But remarkably, this process for the first time begins right in the local churches in the diocese. So every diocese in the world was asked back in October to organize listening sessions in which people came together and responded to questions. And each diocese then collated a synthesis of what they had heard, of what the people were saying. That was then sent to the Bishops' Conference, which then collated a national synthesis. So there was an Irish national synthesis, there was a synthesis for England and Wales, and there was a national synthesis for 116 bishops' conferences across the world. And that took place over the last few months. And then my task, along with 25 others in Frascati, as you just mentioned, was to attempt something really remarkable, which was a global synthesis of all of those national syntheses.
How do you even go about that task, Austen? Because this is such an important exercise in terms of it is the biggest listening exercise the Church has ever done. But I imagine in those syntheses from countries all over the world, the issues facing Catholics there will be so broad and so different. And how did you manage to try and bring it all together?
So what we were doing was compiling a document which is of service now to the whole church in the next phase, which is known as the Continental phase. So each continent will gather as a region next February, March, and we'll discuss their reflections on this document. Now, this document, which is known as the document for the Continental Stage, was an attempt to capture, if you like, what the Holy Spirit is saying to the whole church. So what we were looking for is not a summary of what was going on in each church. We were asking ourselves constantly, what's going on here? Where is the convergence? Where is the, not unanimity, because nobody ever agrees on everything, but where is there a kind of big consensus? And of course, what's remarkable is that, in fact, there is, across the world, some things which people are saying in common, which we were very struck by. We were very struck by the commonalities of what was going on. Of course, you're right, also very strong differences between the different regions, between churches around the world. So what you're looking for is where is the whole church, as it were, coming together around certain issues, desires, hopes, dreams, which capture what the Spirit is saying. So that's what you're doing, but you're also paying attention to what are called the minority voices, which are sometimes very prophetic voices. In other words, this isn't just about what most people are saying, but we're looking for what's constant or consistent across the world.
Austen, I know in some countries, in terms of the listening exercise, there was quite low participation and it was hard to engage people. After doing this process in Frascati, do you feel that there is a broad enough representation of Catholic voices from around the world?
Well, so how do you judge the level of participation? So, for example, here in England and Wales, we reckon that something like 8 or 9% of the mass-going population took part. In the United States, they're saying 700,000. In France, they're saying 200,000. Now, is this a lot or is this very little? And of course, some people say, well, that's not representative, but that's not really the point. The point was that anybody who felt everybody was invited or should have been invited, and many people took part. Actually, unprecedented numbers took part. So there's never been a participation on this scale. So as I say, you have to ask yourself, well, was it a lot or wasn't it? One thing is quite clear to me is that actually those people who did take part are probably, and we know this from surveys, are broadly representative of Catholics more generally. So I think it is I suppose I would say it's not so much the level of participation, but the quality of the participation which really matters. And in reading through those reports, I was really struck and moved by just how motivated people are, by how passionate they are about the church. And that sometimes means they're very critical because they feel that the church is called to be something which at the moment it's not. And that we can see is very much where the spirit is.
You mentioned, Austen, you felt that there was convergence on some issues. What were they?
Well, what we were really, really struck by across the world was this idea that the church is has become a very fragmented and very polarized place. That, in other words, as a church, we are not very good at holding together differences and disagreements and diversity. There's too much tension, there's too much opposition and polarization. So the big idea at the heart of the Frascati document is a passage from a quote from Isaiah 54, enlarge the space of your tent. So it's this idea that the tent of the church, and that means its structures, its way of being, its way of operating, needs to be much broader and more inclusive and more participatory in order and more open to embracing people from the outside, much more missionary, much more open in that sense. There's a line in the document which is that nobody is excluded, and I think this is in a way it's a key line. The call to the church is a missionary universal call. God's love and mercy is for everybody, and that in a sense that's the big idea in the documents. We need to move to be more like that. In other respects, Wendy, we were very struck by the commonality of certain issues. For example, women. The role of women, I would say, was a massive issue in all the documents, and therefore is one of the big issues in the document. But the way that the women's issue is treated varies a lot from continent to continent. So in Europe and North America, there's a lot about the equality of women in the church and questions of ministry and ordination and so on. Whereas in the developing world, it's much more an issue of justice. It's how women are treated in society and how the church needs to stand alongside women who are being oppressed.
And Austen, in terms of what happens next then, what are the next steps?
So the next stage we are now in is known as the Continental Stage, and it begins this way. The document that we've just drawn up in Frascati has now been sent to every bishop in the world with a letter saying, please gather responses to this document, because the idea is not to reopen the whole synod process, but for people to receive the document and react to it and say, you know, what they like, what they dislike. There are 3 questions at the end of the document which we are all called to, if you like, respond to. Each local church then sends each bishop's conference sends delegates to a regional assembly. So in the case of Europe, each bishop's conference will send 4 people, one of whom is the president of the bishop's conference, along with 3 others, and then we have 10 people from each country taking part online. The regional assembly in Europe will be held in Prague at the beginning of February. They will draw up, they will have discussions over a week. They will draw up a document. There will be 7 of these regional assemblies. Each of those assemblies produces a document. Those documents will be in turn synthesized. And then we have the Synod of Bishops itself in Rome in October 2023, and then a second one in October 2024. And what's the objective of all of this? It's learning to be a synodal church, because this is about learning a way of being, which is actually not just for one time, but should be a permanent state of being, which helps us to be more missionary, more participatory, so that people more recognize in the church, indeed, the church of the Acts of the Apostles, the early church, on flame with the mission to proclaim Christ's message to the world.
One of the things that's a difficult task, but it is a big part of Pope Francis's pontificate is, you know, when you do an exercise that's as big as this, a listening exercise, naturally you're going to hear from people where there's a lot of hurts or things where they feel they've been let down by the church. That's certainly reflected in the Irish document. And how do we, with this process, make sure we strike that balance between truth and mercy?
Well, in a way, that is one of the calls of the document, is for a church that is better able to do what Christ, of course, did, which was to proclaim the truth, but also to ensure that everybody was included, that nobody was excluded. And it's not really a balance. It's doing 2 things at the same time better. And I think we've got to learn as a church to do that. One of the things that has most impressed me about this whole process is how there has been a very deep listening going on to victims of abuse, to people who feel marginalized, to the poor. We've got to get better at doing this as a church, but in this process, that has certainly begun. And one of the things that I think I find most moving about this is that people's experience of being listened to, sometimes for the first time by the church, has been for them transformative. In other words, they say, I now see myself as much more part of the church, as part of the mission of the church, because I've been listened to, because my experience has been heard. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about this process, is that it enables greater participation through recognizing ordinary faithful people as being subjects and agents of this process, who are able to take part because the church is of all of us. We are the people of God.
Finally, to ask you, Austen, after having been part of this process and reading what Catholics from all over the world have to say about their, as you say, their hopes, their dreams, their worries, their anxieties, how do you feel about the Catholic Church? Do you feel hopeful for its future?
I feel enormously hopeful. This is the biggest and most important event in the church of my lifetime, certainly since Vatican II, and it feels like this is the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. I think it's opening in a very gentle and beautiful way, an inclusive way, a whole new horizon for the church, and I'm personally very excited by what's to come.
Austen Ivereigh, thank you so much for joining us on iCatholic today, and we'll keep you up to date with the process as it goes on, but for now, thanks for joining us.